right, well, I'll go ahead and get us started here, tell you a little bit about myself, and then launch into my remarks. My name is Max Nelson. I work as a labor policy analyst for an organization called the Freedom Foundation. We're a right-of-center, free market-oriented policy think tank based in Olympia, Washington, been around for a little over 20 years. So that's kind of the short version of who I am. I have some reservations about the minimum wage, as you'll see. And with that, I can begin my remarks. So it's a basic economic principle that basically there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, as the saying goes. You don't need to have an economics degree to know that you don't typically get something for nothing, and that you need to approach claims that you can get something for nothing with some healthy skepticism. And I would argue that we need to approach a minimum wage issue with that same mindset and realize that it involves certain trade-offs. Now, whether we're talking about increasing the minimum wage to $12 an hour, $15 an hour, or $50 an hour, some people are going to benefit and others are going to be harmed in that process. So the questions that we have to ask are, first of all, is the change, is increasing the minimum wage morally defensible? And if so, do the benefits of increasing the minimum wage outweigh the consequences? Is it worth the trade-off? Now, to think about the minimum wage, I would argue that it's not a requirement to pay workers more, but rather the effect of a minimum wage is to outlaw low-skilled or low-paying jobs. All the minimum wage does is specify that if an employer has an employee, the worker must be paid a certain amount. The minimum wage does not guarantee that the employer must continue to employ its workers or that it continue to hire new employees. And a business is only going to hire someone if the worker can provide more value to the business than it costs to pay them. So under a $15 an hour minimum wage, individuals who don't have the skills or education or experience to produce at least $15 an hour of value to their employer are going to have a very difficult time finding work, even if they're perfectly willing to accept a job at $9 an hour, $14.99 an hour, and so forth. Another interesting way that we think about the minimum wage, you know, my parents own a small business, have for many years. What if the government determined that as business owners, my parents weren't making enough money, and so the solution would be to have the government force them to increase their prices? I think most people would recognize that that's wrong on a couple of levels. I mean, first of all, if my parents could charge higher prices for the services that they were providing, they probably would, because that would mean increased profit to them. They realize that increasing prices further will cost them customers. But secondly, why should a government bureaucrat be able to dictate what price my parents get to charge for their services? Now, the U.S. actually had laws like this during the Great Depression era. Under FDR's New Deal policies, the government set minimum prices for certain goods and services. And in one case, the government actually sent a New Jersey dry cleaner to prison because he pressed pants for 35 cents instead of the government-mandated minimum of 40 cents. Now, obviously, a lot of people had problems with that policy, and it was eventually repealed and widely ridiculed. But why do we think of the minimum wage differently? The government is setting a minimum price for labor and preventing individuals from working for less, even if they'd rather have a job at $9.47 an hour, the current state minimum wage, than no job at all. San Francisco recently passed a $15 minimum wage ordinance, one of the consequences of which being that a neighborhood bookstore decided to close down. And when asked by a reporter if he would rather have a $15 minimum wage and no job or his previous bookstore job, an employee answered that he'd rather have his job. But under the $15 minimum wage law in San Francisco, his job is effectively illegal. Now, some argue that it's possible to increase the minimum wage without destroying jobs. But I would argue that this defies both common sense and the economic evidence. Now, basic economics dictates that in general, when you increase the price of a good or service, people will consume less of it. If the price of gas rises, we drive less, we buy more fuel-efficient vehicles, we respond because the price of gas is increased. And I would argue that the same is generally true for labor, that when the government artificially increases the price of entry-level labor, employers will tend to use less of it, which means hiring fewer employees, or laying people off, reducing hours, or hiring more skilled employees. In this process, the least skilled, least educated workers are going to have a tougher time finding employment. Now, employers can also respond to higher labor costs by increasing prices, which effectively takes money out of the economy, takes purchasing power away. They can also respond by substituting automated labor instead of human labor. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that the same week San Francisco's minimum wage increased, a new McDonald's opened up featuring electronic payment kiosks, payment and ordering kiosks, as opposed to human employees. Now, a strong body of research confirms that increasing the minimum wage decreases job opportunities. One survey in 2006 of minimum wage studies published by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that 85% of the most credible studies found that minimum wage increases reduced job opportunities. Now, the strongest argument that minimum wage advocates can make is that a modest increase in the minimum wage produces modest consequences for employment. But increasing the state minimum wage from $9.47, the current level, to $15 is not a modest increase. In fact, it's about as large as every single increase in the minimum wage over its history since 1930 combined into one increase. Even many supporters of a higher minimum wage say that $15 an hour is too extreme, such as Dr. Sylvia Allegretto of UC Berkeley, who called a $15 minimum wage absurd. Now, in addition to reducing labor costs, business can try to offset a higher minimum wage through increased prices. And again, even supporters of higher minimum wages generally, such as Aaron Dubay of the University of Massachusetts, estimate that prices will dramatically increase. Dubay estimated that a $15 minimum wage would push up fast food prices by about 20%. Other analyses by economists at the Heritage Foundation determined that prices could increase at fast food restaurants by 38%, while at the same time decreasing sales by a third and decreasing hours worked by 36%. Price increases also tend to fall on those in society who have the least money to spend. They're least able to absorb increases in prices. So again, in both of these cases, the least skilled, the lower income spectrum is what we are harming the most by increasing the minimum wage. Now, Washington's own experience with the minimum wage confirms these trends. We passed the highest minimum wage law in the country in 1998 at the state level, and here we are 15, 16 years later having the very same discussion. We've got higher teen unemployment than we did then, our poverty rate is unchanged, and growth in low-wage industries is slower than it was before. But here we are again having the same discussion that we had 15, 16 years ago because the problems were not solved the first time. So I would argue again the minimum wage is counterproductive policy. In my view, it's not worth the economic trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. We'll now be holding an open questioning period for the panelists. When you're ready, you can call on whoever. All right, I have questions. Do anyone have questions? Anyone in the audience have questions? No?
Who funds the Heritage Foundation?
I have absolutely no idea. I'm not a part of the organization.
All right. I guess we'll move on to the next speaker, Nicole Keenan.
Sorry.
This is not the first time we've talked. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I'm Nicole Ballestero Keenan. I served on the Income Inequality Advisory Committee for the City of Seattle and worked, I used to work at Puget Sound Sage, which did a bunch of the research for both passing the CTAC living wage as well as a bunch of the research for the Seattle minimum wage. Also had the honor of being, I believe, the youngest person on the Income Inequality Advisory Committee. Can you all hear me? I'm kind of standing, there's a giant block of wood between me and the microphone, so should I move over here? Is this better? Okay.
Yeah, I would love to move it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to?
There we go.
You got it?
All right. Now I have something to stand on. I guess I want to make just 3 simple points about the importance of the minimum wage. And also, can I just say that the policy that many of us were moving in the state of Washington was $12 an hour for statewide minimum wage, and that when we are moving policies that are $15 an hour, we're looking at urban centers like Seattle, LA, New York, where the cost of living is just much higher than you would see in a lot of places that are not urban centers. So I just want to preface that in terms of the reality of the kinds of policies that our organizations have supported. So I have all my notes on my phone. So one of the reasons why raising the minimum wage is just simply important is if you look at Until the 70s, minimum wage pretty much scaled with productivity. So the idea of the more our country produced, the more successful businesses are, the more that pot of money is shared with the people who actually make those businesses successful, the people that work in those industries. Until the 70s, that productivity scaled pretty much evenly with wages. And then you started to see a really big divide. And this started to happen right around deregulation of a lot of different industries, which is one of the things that Freedom Foundation really supports. And so as you start to deregulate industries, and what that means is basically saying, you can do what you want. Like, we won't regulate you or make sure that you're following laws that protect the public good. And so between the 70s until now, if minimum wage had actually tracked with productivity, the minimum wage would be between $15 and $21 an hour. Now, if you look at if the minimum wage federally just simply scaled with inflation, so let's not care about how much we're producing, but it just scales with inflation, so how much more it costs to get by, the federal minimum wage would be over $11 at this moment in time. So just as a simple problem statement, the wages that we have set decades ago are simply not scaling up with how much it costs to live. The next thing is let's talk about income inequality just for a second. So in the city of Seattle, women make 76 to 78 cents to what a man earns per dollar. Now, if you look at women of color, it's 44 to 58 cents of what a man earns. So it's a really stark difference. Now, why does that income inequality exist? So there's a few different reasons. One is, simply racism and sexism. But another is the fact that women and people of color are disproportionately overrepresented in industries that are lower wage. So we're talking about, oh, is that my phone? We're talking about teachers, we're talking about, and by teachers I mean teachers' aides, they make between $11 and $13 an hour. We're talking about human service providers, they come from a social work background, made $11 an hour when I was doing that work. We're also talking about service industry workers. So it's not just a specific set of workers that make low wages, but we're talking about 100,000 people in the city of Seattle alone that make under $15 an hour. Oh, by the way, I can't see your hands if you make those signals, so yeah, thank you. And so it's 100,000 workers just in this city. There's 550,000 workers across the state of Washington that make under just $12 an hour. So one of the reasons why it benefits women and people of color is if you take specifically that slice of workers that are making low wages and raise them up, you actually have a direct policy that can affect income inequality for women and people of color in our state. Now, the next thing is, why is the minimum wage good for our economy as a whole? So according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and this is the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis, they have an input-output model called RIMS-2. For every additional dollar that you put into people's household incomes, it generates another 35 cents in economic activity. Now, why is that? So let's say I made $10 more today than I would have otherwise. That's a lunch that I could go buy. Maybe I'll go over to Cedars and grab a falafel or something. And that's more money that that business then has that they wouldn't have had otherwise. When you take that extra money they make, and then the people that work for them ideally make a little bit more, whether it be in tips or in wages, and then they spend that money, it becomes this ripple effect. So in the city of Seattle, thanks to the fact that we've raised wages to $15 over the next 3 to 7 years, depending on the business size, low-wage workers in the city of Seattle itself will have made over $3 billion more over the next 10 years than they would have otherwise. In terms of economic activity, that's $4 billion in economic activity greater than there would have been otherwise. So there's some really great gems of, if we look at and study the city of Seattle over the next few years, we can really see the benefit that it causes. All right. Thank you. That's the end of my comments. I'm doing this entirely extemporaneously, so thank you so much for your time.
All right, and another 5-minute question period.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, sure.
We often hear the argument about how this will solve income inequality. The question I have is that Washington State has the highest minimum wage in the country, and yet we are 13th in the nation when it comes to income inequality as measured by Gini coefficient. So it seems to me that Washington State, if the minimum wage solves income inequality, then Washington State should have the least income inequality. But when you actually look at a ranking of the states in the country, the states with the lowest income inequality are the ones that have $725 to $750 as their minimum wage. How do you explain that?
I would say that income inequality is in a 1-to-1 ratio. If you could take into account all of the different factors that address income inequality and also the different factors of economic opportunity in the state. So perhaps one of the reasons why we have income inequality is because we have a pretty large farm worker population in this state and they don't benefit from the minimum wage. Maybe that's one of the reasons why. There's a number of different factors that attribute to what is and is not contributing to income inequality in our region.
I guess the state that does the best is Utah. They have a lot of farmers in Utah. There's a lot of farmers in Idaho. They all have better Gini coefficient. So if it's not farmers, because there are states with lots of farmers, more farmers than Washington that have better income, what else could it be?
Well, another thing with Gini coefficient is that it compares the people with the most money to the people with the least money. And we have Bill Gates in this state. So, I mean, that kind of might throw it off a little bit. Yes?
So Nicole, you mentioned toward the beginning of your speech that the minimum wage basically tracked with productivity until the 1970s, and then after the 1970s, productivity continued to increase and the minimum wage, the value of the minimum wage did not. I'm curious, is that the productivity of all workers, or is that looking at the productivity of specifically minimum wage workers?
It is the productivity of, it's actually looking at GDP compared to wages. So GDP would be all workers.
Similar question, if I may, on inflation. You noted that inflation, if the federal minimum wage had kept up with inflation since the 70s, it would be $11 an hour. What about Washington State's minimum wage? Doesn't our minimum wage increase with inflation? Is that same argument true for Washington State's minimum wage?
One of the reasons why Washington State's minimum wage is in at 11 right now is because we started to scale it with inflation just about 1998, so however long ago that was. And we increased the minimum wage by just 25 to 50 cents at that time, and then we scaled it with inflation. So if we had actually retroactively scaled it with inflation from the 1960s, or even when minimum wage began, then we would have had an $11 an hour minimum wage at the moment.
I'll keep asking unless somebody else has something.
Go ahead.
All right. So you noted toward the end that there is a stimulus effect. When low-wage workers have more money from a higher minimum wage, they go spend that money in the economy. I was wondering if you could point to a study that found that on net, there is an increase in economic activity when you increase the minimum wage.
Yes, actually Michael Reich put one out regarding San Jose about in 2014 or 2012, I can't remember. And I'm also the author of 2 reports that recommend that.
Now, did your 2 reports take into account increased prices and or decreased employment from a higher minimum wage, or did they just estimate if X number of workers got a raise, that would be added money in the economy?
We actually did account for disemployment effects, particularly in the CTAC study, and found that the net overall increase would still be positive.
Did you find that there were going to be any disemployment effects in CTAC?
We assumed the worst. We actually looked at Washington Policy Center study, and they are a pretty well-known right-of-center think tank, and assumed their numbers for what disemployment would be, which was actually remarkably high. No study that I've seen actually confirms this amount, but they said, I think it would be a 10% loss in jobs. And so we assumed that in the CTAC study, and then found that the net increase would still be a creation of 100 jobs and I think 14 million increase in the economic activity for CTAC.
Yeah.
So 100 jobs would be created, but how many would be lost?
So we actually said that in total there would be 416 jobs created in the city of SeaTac for an increase to 15 for 6,000 people, and then assumed the Washington Policy Center's numbers that would reduce 300, so there would still be a total net increase of 100 jobs.
Final question? Okay.
All right, thank you. I'm a little bit of a numbers geek, so thanks for listening.
So next up we have David Jones.
I'm not going to use her box. I'm David Jones. I own 3 Subway restaurants. I've owned 6 at some point in my life. One of them was on 15th and Roosevelt. But I own 3 right now, and then from our franchise ownership, we have, my wife and I have founded a company called the Blazing Onion Burger Company, and we have 6 of those, and we're just in the middle of designing our 7th and doing a whiskey bar in it. So I've just been testing. I've been doing a lot of testing lately. So, but anyway, that's who I am. I am privileged to be on the Fast Casual Industry Council for the restaurant industry for the National Restaurant Association, and so I get to travel all over and talk about fast casual, which for you would be Panera and Chipotle and other restaurants similar to that are fast casual. And the Blazing Onion is actually fast casual in the restaurant and full service in the lounge. So I am not a proponent of the 15 for a couple of reasons. One, for me, I am a franchise owner, and because I'm a franchise owner, they decided to lump us into big business. But when you're a franchise owner, you're not big business. You pay for everything that happens in your restaurant. My very first Subway was in West Seattle, and my very first Subway made negative $10,000 income the year before I bought it. So my job was to go in there and turn it around so I could actually make some money. I had worked really hard and put my wife through college. She graduated, worked her way up to controller, and then she in turn let me go own a small business. I thought it was wonderful. I was getting to coach my kids and spend time with my kids, but after a year my wife told me we didn't make enough money and I was going to have to go get a job again. And I did not want to go work for somebody after I had tasted the sweet life of working for myself for a year. But unfortunately, we had only made $20,000, which was a huge turnaround, but it wasn't quite enough money to make the switch. So what I did instead was I got my brother to invest some money in me, and then I built a second one. Jared lost a bunch of weight, and so my sales went up, and so then I built a third one and a fourth one and a fifth one. So after the 5th one, we opened the Blazing Onion, and that is classified as small business. We have 210 employees, but according to the City of Seattle, that's small business. We make a lot more money than my Subways, percentage-wise and dollars-wise, but it's also considered small business by Seattle. But my Subway franchise, which doesn't make near as much money and has 17 employees in Seattle, is considered a big business, which is just totally wrong. And going back to price, I have to increase my prices because of the minimum wage. So I went to 11. Most small businesses and large businesses went to the same number. But what happens next year, January 1st, is I have to go to 13, while my neighbors, I have a store at Seattle University, there's 8 restaurants on the row, 2 are franchise, 6 are normal, are small business owners, and these 6 will go to $12 an hour, and the 2 franchise businesses will go to $13 an hour. So $1 of increase for me affects me by 23% of my total income in the store. So what small businesses are forced to do to react to this is they're forced to either cut labor or to raise prices. For my wife and I, we have a very strong family atmosphere, and so cutting labor is not one of our choices that we want to even go down. So we have decided that we're only going to raise prices to recover from all of this as it ends up. It's a 25% increase for me. Now, different small businesses will tell you different numbers, but that's because they have to run their own books. My Subways are all high volume, so I can do a 23 to 25% increase and be fine. Some other small businesses, Subway owners, don't make as much money or don't bring in as much sales, and so they will have to increase prices actually a little bit higher. Oops, I lost my notes. I wasn't looking at them. So, second thing is, I guess the benefit of franchises. I've heard the benefit of franchises is that we get to have all this marketing, and so our sales are really gigantic compared to a small business. but we pay for all that marketing. So in our case, Subway doesn't pay for anything, we pay for that. I pay for all my marketing at Blazing Onion, I pay for all my marketing at Subway, and then it's compiled at Subway, and then it's put out on TV because there's a power of a number of stores. So even if I go up in sales by a certain number, I have to hit a pretty large number to pay for that advertising that I'm paying for. And for me right now, it's 3.5% of my total sales go to advertising. Then 8% goes to royalties. So there's quite a bit difference in there. I'm trying to recover from that 11.5%. The benefit of having the franchise is that it taught me how to run a business, taught me how to be successful. When I opened my first Blazing Onion, the first 3 months were about the worst experience of my life. My wife was beating me on the chest and telling me, "What have you got us into?" It was awful. I could write a book. I'm writing a book right now on that opening because it was so bad. But we figured it out, and then we grew that company, and now we have 6 and going on 7 and 8. The other impact that I would say for restaurants is that in the restaurant industry, 50% of new restaurants survive the first 5 years. The other 50% don't survive. One of the reasons why is because people like food, so they think they can own a restaurant. So, you know, I like spaghetti, so I'll open an Italian restaurant. But it doesn't always work like that because you have to have a financial background, you have to have some food talent also. And so the combination of both is what makes you successful, so 50% fail. When you add this extra burden, price increases, a lot of the owners really panic. I tried to help organize the 49 Subway owners in Seattle to be on the same page, to figure out a good approach on this. And what happened was about a month before April 1st, everybody splintered off and went their own direction because they all just kind of got scared and didn't want to talk anymore. And so they all ended up in increasing prices at a different amount. I think I'm one of the few Subway owners in Seattle that actually felt like they increased their prices the right amount and haven't lost customers and feel like I'm surviving it. But most of the Subway owners that I talked to feel like it was a disaster and they're losing money right now. The other thing I mentioned before was every dollar increase of minimum wage cost me 23% of my income. So the total $15 is going to cost me, I think, 118% or something of my income because it's $553. So for me to recover that, I have to increase prices by a large amount, which not every customer is going to be okay with. So they're talking about how we're going to have more money to spend, but when you have more money to spend, you don't eat as much if everybody raises the prices on food. You get food from the grocery store a little bit more often, and that, again, impacts small businesses. And that's all I got.
All right, questions? We'll start with the panelists.
I think you got some in the audience. We'll defer to the students.
Okay, Mr. Jones, do you want to just field questions for, as you see?
Go ahead.
So your experiences with the Subway franchise, is that typical of other franchises around Seattle?
The whole experience with Subway franchises?
Yeah, like your experience with trying to group the 49 Subways in Seattle?
No, I'm a role model. I do really well with the Subway franchise. I spent a lot of time working on improving stores that were a disaster before I came to Subway, and we've saved all of our profit sharing from Denny's. I worked at Denny's for 13 years and put that into the Subways and turned it around, and then I knew that the growth was a thing. So we didn't have living room furniture until we bought our second Blazing Onion. So we kept our living room, it was just a free room, and we put our money right back into Subway and kept buying another one, and that's how we grew. Yes?
At this point, I guess I have a question as to why wouldn't you just kind of cut your losses with Subway? And because it seems like, from your point of view as a small business owner on the Seattle side, maybe just kind of separating you from the franchisor side, it seems like, you're doing so well with your Blazing Onions right now, and that's making a lot of money. You're telling us how much better it is than the franchise. Wouldn't it be better to cut your losses? And even if franchises maybe in this whole city died, on a whole, wouldn't we be allowed to just like take advantage of that power vacuum and like have more of like, you know, your burger restaurants or like places like that?
You could, but 2 years ago, that would have been a great thought. But the moment the $15 thing passed, all of our equities in Seattle plummeted. So we had Subway owners that were selling their stores for a certain amount, it's a percentage of annual income, and that percentage dropped by about 20% when this happened. So no one wants to buy any right now, so I could sell it for a huge loss, or I could find a way for me to survive and hopefully figure it out and make it work, and then I could sell it without taking a loss. So that's what I've chosen
Like
to
you
do.
couldn't completely liquidate it or anything? And
You-
just get rid of the Subway altogether though? 'Cause, like,
No,
that's-
because you sign a franchise agreement that basically says they own your first child. No, you can't get out of a Subway.
Piggybacking on that then, like, if you're part of like the National Restaurant Association and stuff, like, are there not more organizations that kind of are there to be, like, to kind of like develop leadership within like that community for business owners to remain successful and like to kind of grow that anyway on that kind of level? Or is it like, are there mentorship programs or anything?
It's not necessarily how the franchise model works. What happens with it is if you decide to close shop and go out of business, Subway still owns the real estate, and so they get another franchisee to take that spot. And if the minimum wage drives them out of business, there's a third franchisee that takes that spot. And so eventually Subway survives that. But Subway isn't affected by it, it's really just a franchisee that's affected by it.
Anything?
Well, yeah, actually, I think you just answered it in some ways, because it seems that actually the franchise model screws you over, too. It's actually the model itself that's some of the problem.
Well, I just wouldn't agree with that. I don't think the franchise model is what helped me be successful and learn how to run a Blazing Onion. Without it, and the Blazing Onion, even with all my learning, was 3 months of hell. So, so I wouldn't say that at all, but the franchise model is what helped me get there. And so I think it's a good model. It teaches people business.
I was just wondering, so you kind of exposed this flaw in the system, right, where franchises operate under different rules than your Blazing Onion stores, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is that a flaw in the minimum wage system, in the raising the minimum wage? And would you support it if your franchises didn't have to operate under those rules?
I would support a reasonable amount to go up annually. I think $2 is too much, but I would support that. And I always support minimum wage increases because I started at $2.12, so I would have hated staying at that forever. So you know, I'd always support that. I just don't like that they're doing it differently, and I don't think there should even be big business, small business. I think we should all be the same.
Is there a final question? Oh, okay. All right.
Subway sandwiches for everybody. Oh, no.
So next up, we have Senator Pramila.
Good evening, everyone. How are you doing? It's great to be here. My name is Pramila Jayapal. I'm the state senator from the 37th Legislative District, which starts in Capitol Hill, runs all the way down through South Seattle, and into Skyway and Renton. And I'm really proud that it is the most racially and economically diverse district in the state. And we kind of have the men versus women's team. I know which one I want to be on. But I want to say a couple of things. I actually served on the Income Inequality Committee with Nicole. This was before I became a state senator. I've been an activist my whole life, an organizer and an activist. I started an organization called One America, which is now the largest immigrant advocacy organization in the state. Some of you may know it. And that was a really interesting experience to go through because I think we were trying to deal with very complex issues. I don't think that minimum wage is actually a simple argument because I do think that there are lots of concerns and fears from small business owners, including the gentleman you just heard from, about how they're going to make their businesses work. And that is balanced against another much larger set of issues around how people actually make enough to make ends meet, how they manage to live in a city that has tremendous wealth for some people but not for all, and in a state where that's the case as well. So I was really pleased with the compromise we reached, but make no mistake, it is a compromise. I think many of us on the committee would have preferred actually to have one rate for everybody, not to have a small versus big business rate, because the limits where you have to draw the lines are very arbitrary. And many of us understood, actually, I have a lot of franchises in my district, a lot of immigrant-owned businesses in my district, small businesses in my district. Many of us understood that there were some businesses that were not going to benefit from this model, that it was going to be, let's say that it was going to be much harder for some businesses than for other businesses. But in the end, what we had to do is create a policy, and any policy, you've heard it's like sausage making, it is. I mean, any policy making is very, very challenging to come to a place where you can get the best benefit for the most number of people. So certainly there are examples in every realm of where it's been incredibly easy for businesses to go to this level, and other ones where businesses have struggled. And businesses will continue to open and close for as long as you and I are alive and beyond that. So that is the way that the world works. So our deal in Seattle was, I think, an incredibly gradual step for the majority of businesses. And the very large businesses go to 15 much sooner, but I'll tell you, there were a lot of people who wanted us to go to 15 now, immediately, didn't even want to have any kind of a break. So I really feel like what we did in Seattle is craft something that works for the majority of people, but most importantly, works for Seattle's values of having a city that actually allows people to live, to earn a living, and if you work hard and you work full-time, you should be able to earn a living. And the reality right now is that because of a number of large corporations, because of a number of laws across the country, we are subsidizing, as the government, we are actually subsidizing the cost of people not making enough. We are subsidizing corporations for their not paying people high enough wages to value the work that they provide and the health benefits that they need. And just one example of that is Walmart. Walmart across the country costs taxpayers $6.2 billion in healthcare, Medicaid, other costs to the government that Walmart is not paying, but guess who pays that? The government pays that because people don't earn enough. They're on Medicaid, they're on a whole bunch of other things. And so I've always believed that raising the minimum wage is actually one of the most responsible ways to actually reduce government spending. And when I went to the Senate this January, I am very proud to be the sponsor, the prime sponsor of a bill to raise the minimum wage to $12 across the state. We did not go to $15, even though all of the research tells us that a living wage across the state of Washington, wherever you are, is actually significantly higher. The estimates run anywhere from 14 to 22, I don't remember numbers very well, so Nicole or somebody else will tell me what that is. But the numbers that you actually need to be able to live, which means childcare, which means getting your health care, not going bankrupt if you have a major illness, which is one of the big things that's happening, and certainly Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act have helped us to overcome that. But again, we were trying to look for a solution that would work across the state and that would help Washington to once again be a leader. As you may know, Senator Patty Murray has also introduced a $12 minimum wage bill, and it also, like my bill, would take 4 years to get to $12 across the country. Our bill goes from $9.47 to $12 over 4 years. So by 2020, you're at 4 years. That's only about $1.67 more than what you would pay anyway, because our minimum wage in the state of Washington is actually tied to inflation, so it does increase every year. So the additional amount that businesses would have to pay is very, very small. But in 2015, we are having very similar debates to the debates that we had when a national minimum wage bill was first passed in 1938. Back then, President Roosevelt said he was seeking, and this is a quote, legislation to end starvation wages and intolerable hours. And I'll tell you, in 2015, I've heard the exact same arguments coming from my Republican colleagues across the aisle, that this is going to kill jobs and opportunity and kill business. But we know that those arguments are false. And we know that because we have seen the economy continue to be able to absorb the minimum wage increases, just as they have in Washington State. My fellow panelist mentioned that we actually have seen Washington has the highest minimum wage in the country. It is indexed to inflation now. And we have been able to absorb those. The reason we have income inequality, there are many reasons, as Nicole said, but one of the reasons is we have the most regressive, unfair tax system in the country. We are number one, behind Florida, behind Texas, anywhere else you want to talk about. And the reason for that is because we have this sales tax as our primary form. 60% of our revenue comes from sales tax. So there are a lot of reasons why we have income inequality. This minimum wage argument or debate is really about taking a small step towards lifting the floor for the workers who are at the very bottom. And the reason I'm glad to be on Team Woman is because it really is, let me just be very clear about this. Women make up the majority of minimum wage earners and the majority of tipped wage earners. So the reality is, it is women and people of color, I should have said women and people of color make up the majority, because it is women and people of color that are going to benefit from this the most. And anybody who tries to tell you differently is just not telling the truth and hasn't actually been into the communities where we know that women and people of color work. So I'm really glad that we're having this debate. The reality is 3/4 of the state supports an increase in the minimum wage. And this is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. 4 Republican states passed a minimum wage in 2014, and I believe we're going to be the next one to do that. Thank you.
So I have a question. I want to go back to the moral arguments, because I believe the minimum wage is a moral argument as well. You talked about Seattle values, and I believe that a prominent Seattle value is choice. Choice in all variety of things, whether they be social or economic. So I guess my moral question is, if this gentleman right here with this pencil decides to hire this gentleman with the phone to paint his fence, to work on his car, to do something, right? And those two guys right there come to a mutually acceptable arrangement where you're willing to pay and you're willing to do the job for that salary. What exactly is your place, either as an individual or as government, to put yourself between those two men and decide that your values should trump their values? Well,
this is a fundamental issue of what we believe the role of government to be. I believe the role of government should be to regulate our environment so that we do have fairness and justice within our laws. If it was just a matter of choice, then we would allow people to work for $2. Actually, that is the federal tipped minimum wage, by the way. We would continue to allow things to happen that are absolutely not in line with our values. So I think
if this man right here wants to work for $10, he's willing to do that, and he's willing to pay, you believe you should be able to interject yourself and say, no, sir, you cannot make that choice for yourself. I'm going to make it for you.
Yes, I do, with a certain limit. There's no question in my mind that at the core, if you believe that you have a society that operates on rules and values, that you need to have government intervention. And this is an age-old argument between Republicans and Democrats, but the old Republicans from many years ago actually believed in government intervention too. You know, somebody said, can't remember who it was, said that Nixon was our last great Democratic president. Nixon believed in a lot of things that I believe in. That was the belief of the United States of America, that you could have a government by the people, for the people, and with the people. And our belief today is that we need more regulation to ensure that the people at the very top are doing what they need to do to share, and that the people on the very bottom are getting the dream of American democracy and the American future that we promise. In this state, let me just tell you this, in this state, between 2009 and 2012, all of the income growth in this state accrued to the top 1%. You want to know why we have a problem with housing, with all the other issues that you're dealing with, why college students cannot actually afford to go to college anymore? We pay today 30% of a 4-year college education. We used to pay a decade ago 70%. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure government regulation is saying, look, these are the limits of what is actually right, and this is how we uphold our values. And I'm very proud to believe that. Yeah.
I can't remember who it was, but they said that when you raise the minimum wage, you raise the value of a worker, that the worker has to be valued as more. So when you raise that value and someone doesn't meet it, and they don't have the education, then they are forced to go to college and gain more education. And that creates more students who cannot pay for their education. How does this balance?
Well, the value of a worker is inherent. We don't create the value of a worker. There is a value to every human being and to the work they do. I would argue that the value of the worker is honestly devalued over and over again. If you just look at wages keeping up with productivity and with inflation, what you see is we haven't. So we have continued to devalue the worker. If we paid the worker more, you guys would actually be able to earn more to be able to go to college. And if we were actually not paying for all of the benefits and Medicaid and a number of other things that government pays for the people that need it the most, then we would actually be able to put that back into funding college in the same way that we used to.
Mr. Nelson's question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Would you say that the primary purpose of the minimum wage is to better off or increase the welfare of low-income workers, or is the purpose of the minimum wage to decrease taxpayer subsidies of corporations?
Well, I think they're tied. I mean, I think that, obviously you're doing both at the same time. If you're increasing the ability of low-wage workers to actually earn what they deserve and be valued, and you're decreasing then at the same time their ability to rely on the government, or their need to rely on the government.
But aren't some low-wage workers going to lose certain or no longer qualify for certain government assistance if the minimum wage is increased, leaving them basically in the same place they were before?
Well, it depends on what your policies are. I mean, it depends on where you draw those thresholds. It depends on exactly how you do it. But do you, can I ask a question back to the panel? Do you believe that we should be subsidizing Walmart?
I don't think that this type of, I don't think that the existence of a minimum wage that is less than $15 an hour is a direct subsidy.
So you believe that the $6.2 billion that taxpayers pay across the country in order to pay for the health and benefits of Walmart workers, only Walmart workers who do not receive those taxes, those wages and benefits, you think that's okay?
I'm not saying I think it's okay. I'm saying I don't think it's a direct subsidy. I don't want to burn up our time too much. Maybe I'll just address it in my speech. We've got, there's two different perspectives, and I'm not necessarily going to make an argument about which one is correct. But traditionally, we've considered caring for the least fortunate in society to be a burden on all of society. Hence, we pay for it through taxes that are generally broadly shared. The argument that corporations and employers alone should be responsible for addressing that issue is new. That's a different perspective. And I haven't yet seen an argument for why that is a justified change.
Actually, that's not what I said. That's very different from what I said, because I did not say that corporations should bear all of the burden. What I said is that we are not paying workers the value. When you have CEOs making incredible amounts of money, but not paying the workers at the bottom what they actually deserve, then what you have is taking advantage of workers at the bottom, when corporations should be paying those workers a higher wage, and then those workers would not be reliant on government subsidies.
I think we have a different determination, a different way of determining what work is compensatable for. I'm not going to say value, because I agree with you that all work has inherent value and dignity, but that's a different question than compensation.
But do you believe that if a worker works 8 hours a day full-time, that they should be earning enough to make ends meet?
I believe that they should. I believe that's a goal worth striving for. I don't believe that increasing the minimum wage is the best way to get there.
Can I answer that? Do you believe? Well,
I think you get to go next too.
If the worker is putting 8 hours in as a nurse,
you get to go next.
If they're stacking toothpicks, no. Right? It's like this idea that all work is the same. If all work is the same, then why are you people here? My sense is that you came here because you don't believe that all value is inherent, that you don't believe that all work is the same, and that you don't believe that stacking toothpicks should be compensated the same as putting in an IV. That's why we're
Actually,
in
it's not, Representative Manueller. You know, I think if you look at the differences across the wage scale, you will find that there are a lot of people earning a lot of money, and actually the people at the very bottom who should be getting just a small lift up so that all those CEOs can earn billions of dollars is actually, we don't value work the same. I don't know how you could say that. There's nothing in our economy that would substantiate the idea that all work is valued the same. It's just not true. We have people, women, working 8 hours a day and serving as the people that take care of your kids at home, sweeping, cleaning hotel rooms. How about our teachers? And they are not being paid enough to even make ends meet. That is not stacking toothpicks, Representative Manueller, and I don't think that you can say that the work that's done at the bottom is not to be valued. I hope that's not what you're saying.
It's not. All right. So thank you.
All right. Well, my name is Matt Manueller, and I am a professor, so I am going to use the podium because I'm used to it. So
You're just taller.
I'm just taller. Right. Okay. I teach political economy at Central Washington University, and as my part-time, lower-paid job, I serve in the legislature with the good senator here. So I have both a political and academic perspective. I do need to get one thing off my chest first. My family is from Boise. We're a little sore that you stole our football coach, but I'm going to let that slide for this evening. I participate in a lot of minimum wage debates in and out, and the arguments for us become a little tiresome because they're over and over and over again. One side will argue that if we raise the minimum wage, it will address income inequality, it will pull people out of poverty, it will increase access to education, it will increase their access to housing and education, and it does none of those things. It does none of those things. None of the empirical literature suggests a correlation or causation between an increased minimum wage and income inequality or poverty. In fact, in many cases, the empirical literature suggests quite the opposite. But if you don't want to get bogged down in statistics, I guess I would just ask you a simple rhetorical question. If increasing the minimum wage improves all of those variables, then why isn't Washington the best in the nation at all of those variables? We have the highest minimum wage in the country. Why don't we have the least income inequality, the best access to health care? Why don't we have the less poverty? We don't. We are a living, breathing, natural experiment about the effects of the minimum wage. Now, the good senator mentioned something. She said, we have proven in Washington, because we are a case study, that we have absorbed these costs. No, my friends, we have not. You have. Because the other side of that argument is, yes, Washington has absorbed those costs. And people who run subways have figured out a way to survive. But Washington has the highest youth unemployment in the country. 28% youth unemployment in Washington. Higher than any other state, and it's not a coincidence that we also have the highest minimum wage. But folks, if we want to talk about people of color, Washington State has a 38% minority youth unemployment. Also, the highest in the country. We are crippling these folks at the beginning. When they're trying to learn how to get into the workforce, get job skills, we have created an environment that deters their entrance. It is not a coincidence that we have the highest minimum wage, highest minority youth unemployment, and the highest youth unemployment in the country. If these things don't work, then why do we continually push them? And this I'm going to put back on you. I appreciate the fact that you are here tonight. This makes you the exception, not the norm. I encourage you to do more things like this. Because the reason arguments like the minimum wage work is because in general there is pervasive economic illiteracy in Washington and in the United States. And when you are not armed with the facts, with theory, then enterprising politicians
okay, can sell you something like a minimum wage and tell you, my friends, I have found the fountain of youth, right? I have found a policy that will address income inequality, poverty, education, healthcare, housing, and there'll be no consequences, right? Unless you are armed with knowledge and theory and data, then we can sell those things to you. So it is partially our responsibility as politicians to be honest, but it is also partially your responsibility to be educated about economics and markets, because that's the world that you live in. So I want to tackle a few things that we've heard tonight. One, we can increase the minimum wage without losing jobs. Let me ask you a completely different question. How many of you have heard about the carbon tax that's being proposed right now? Carbon tax. What is it trying to address? What do we want a carbon tax for? Global warming, right? We want to increase the carbon tax to address global warming. How many of you think it will work? That if we increase the price of carbon, people will buy less of it? Anybody? Show of hands. Okay. So some of you think that if I increase the price of carbon, you'll buy just the same amount?
The price elasticity of gasoline is almost zero.
Yeah, the price elasticity of labor is also pretty inelastic in the short run. So we can't go out as politicians and say to you, folks, we're going to increase the price of carbon, because if we increase the price of carbon, you will buy less of it and the global warming will be solved. But on the next day, we're going to go tell you, if you increase the price of labor, people will buy more of it and it will create employment. How is that humanly possible that in one good, if you increase the price of it, you buy more of it, and in the other good, if you increase the price of it, you buy less of it? I would put it to you, you can only have one of those arguments, but you cannot have both. Two, we've talked about regressivity and the poor. Let me tell you one of the awkward truths about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a tax on one set of poor people to help a different set of poor people. It is pitched to you as a tax on the wealthy to help the poor. It doesn't work that way. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself this rhetorical question. Do you think Paul Allen shops at Taco Bell for lunch? Do you think that Bill Gates goes to 7-Eleven for a Slurpee? No. The people who patron minimum wage-based employment are other poor people, are other lower middle class people. So what you end up having is one group of poor people paying higher prices to help a different group of poor people. So if you think that this is going to somehow redistribute income from the wealthy to the poor, you're not. If you're a wealthy person, you're going to a 5-star restaurant. If the minimum wage goes up, great. You just charge $30 for the steak instead of $28. You'll survive. It's the person selling the $6 bowl of noodles that is the one who's going to suffer. It's a tax on one group of poor people to help a different set of poor people. And last, I guess because I'm running out of time here, folks, I want to tackle this argument that somehow if you increase the minimum wage, you're going to put money into the economy, that you're going to add $3 billion. Anybody got $5 in the room? Anybody got a $5 bill? Anyone? You have a $5 bill. Okay. Sir, if you work for him, okay, and I as government decide that I know better what to pay you than he does or you do, and I say, sir, give him $5 more. Will he have $5 more? Yes. Will there be an additional $5 in the room? No. Okay? You move money around. If you think that the minimum wage will increase the GDP, I have an experiment for you tonight. Go home, fill up your bath, get a cup from your kitchen, dump the cup in one side of the pool, of the bathtub, and then dump it in the other side, and figure out if there's more water in the bath or the same amount of water in the bath. I would put to you, if you have to do that more than 3 times, you might have a problem. But I would suggest that probably after 2 times that you have dumped water out, you'll realize, hey, I'm just moving water around. I'm not adding water to the bathtub. That's why the minimum wage doesn't work, and I'm getting the hook, I guess. 7 minutes goes fast. In class, I get an hour. So. Go ahead, ma'am.
You suggest, oh, sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, on youth employment, do you know what % of minimum wage workers in Washington State are youth under 21?
Well, yeah, that's one of the problems is that one of the metrics is 16 to 19, and another one sometimes goes 18 to 24, and there's an overlap in the 16, 17, and 18. So, you know, minimum wage is still an entry-level job. I mean, a lot of people try to argue that it's not, but it's still predominantly a youth and entry-wage level job.
I'll tell you that the statistic is 10%. 10% of Washington minimum wage workers across the state are youth. That's 10%.
So what that tells me is that youth aren't working because the minimum wage has driven youth out of the market, which is what I'm trying to say.
Here's my next question for you. And your
Okay.
speeches, I got to practice on this because he made these same speeches on the floor. So
Yeah.
we got
Correct
to hear them
arguments
then.
never change.
But I didn't actually get to interact because I'm on the Senate floor. He's on the House floor, so I appreciate this opportunity. Okay, here's the other question I have for you. What has been the trajectory of kids in school? So in other words, in the early 1990s versus 2010, what percentage of kids are actually in school, which might prevent or affect the question of whether they're actually out there working?
Right. So the implication of the question is that high youth unemployment is not because of the minimum wage, but because of other factors like you're staying in school. That would be a good argument if youth unemployment were 28% in all 50 states. But it turns out that it's only 28% in Washington. So is the argument that only Washington kids are staying in school and in the other 49 states they aren't? So part of doing regression analysis is that you have control variables, right? And that you look at all the variables that are common to everything, and then you isolate the variable that is unique. So yes, kids are staying in school longer. More kids are going to school. However, A, you're not counted as unemployed, okay? And two, the argument would only work is if only Washington kids are staying in school, but none of the other 49 states are. So that argument just doesn't hold up.
So what was the number? What's the percentage of
I
kids
don't
who
know.
are in school? Let me give it to you just so you know. It's in the early 1990s, 77% of 16 to 19-year-olds were in school. And now, in 2010, that number was 85%. And in addition, attendance in summer school has increased nearly threefold in the past 20 years. So I would argue that we're doing a better job of getting kids into school, keeping them there, and allowing them to have educational
But
opportunities.
those 85% of
during
kids
summer.
are not considered unemployed. That is not how we measure
Just wanted to
unemployment.
make sure people understood what the statistic was.
Can we get-
Sure.
Yeah, so I would love you to actually explain what an input-output model does to the group instead of using the water bath analogy.
Okay, so the input-output model they're looking at is that it's based on this idea that there's a multiplier. John Maynard Keynes' classic work said, hey, Mr. Roosevelt, if you're $300 billion down, you only have to spend $30 billion because the $30 billion will get spent 10 times. It's the idea, if I give you $5, you might go buy something from her, okay, for $4. And she might take that $4 and spend it, buy something for you for $3. And then you'd buy something for her for $2. And my $5 becomes 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, this idea of the multiplier. But for every output, there's also an input. It's $5 that I don't have anymore that didn't get spent, $4, $3, $2. So the only difference between an input model and an output model is the difference between the marginal propensities to consume. You can make a marginal argument that the minimum wage can help is if I, with $5, were only going to spend 70% of my money, but we're going to spend 80% of my money, 80%. So you can make this argument that on the margin at a multiplier difference, there will be a minimal amount. But what these studies actually do is they assume that I would spend 0 and you would spend 80 or 100. And that's why the input models are generally flawed.
So I'd like to respond to that by saying people who make between $30,000 and $39,000 spend 100% of their income, whereas people who are making $70,000 spend only 63% of their income. So I think it kind of goes along with what you're saying.
It also assumes that the other 27% gets hidden in a box under your bed, and it doesn't. It gets put back into the economy as marginal propensity to save, which other entrepreneurs then come and borrow and put back into the economy the other way. So all the money is coming back in the economy. It's just coming back in different ways. At the end of the day, raising the minimum wage by making you give you $5 more will redistribute some income, but it will not change how much income is actually in the room.
You mentioned earlier that you described minimum wage as an entry-level wage, and you're focusing a lot on youth workers and saying that there's not minimum wage jobs that are available for them, especially if the wage increases. And so what we learned from Pramila is that 10% of the workers are considered youth, and we know in Seattle from Nicole's research that about 5% of workers, is it low wage workers or just workers in general?
Minimum wage.
Okay, 5% of minimum wage workers in Seattle are youth, and on the national level, about 12% of low wage workers are youth. So what that means is there's a lot of workers that are above 20 and above who are using minimum wage as their income. 50% of them are working full time, 50% of them are earning half the family's income, average age is 35. So how is that an entry-level job if it's contributing to their income, to their well-being, to their stability? This isn't pocket change. This is paying the rent for year after year after year, buying the food.
I'm not sure I quite understand what the question is, in the sense that, are you saying that minimum wage jobs are not entry-level jobs?
Well, yeah, I am. I am saying that because entry level assumes that you stay in there for a short period of time and then you progress to a higher paying job. Maybe you progress to a different level of skill. But what we're seeing is people stay in these jobs for 20-some years. So how is
that is not a moving argument to me. I got to tell you that. I hear that all the time. People will come and testify before my committee and they'll say, I got a job at Domino's making $12 an hour when I was 22 and now I'm 31 and I'm still making the same amount at Domino's. I'm like, good God, how about a little bit of initiative? How many of you have had a minimum wage job in your life? How many of you are here tonight at UW because you don't want a minimum wage job? Okay, that's called initiative. How about if I told you, you know what, don't bother with your education. I'll just pay you more anyways, right? So yes, these are entry-level jobs. Whether you're 30 or 25 or 20, if you're making minimum wage, that is an entry-level job. Develop some skills. Go to night school. Go to community college. Go to your manager and say, how can I become assistant manager? But show some initiative, work your way up the ladder. Do not come to government and say, I want that guy to pay me more money because I want it.
There's a question back there.
I think the woman in white was first.
Oh, I have two questions.
I don't know if you'll allow that, but go ahead.
Okay, do you believe that raising the minimum wage then would incentivize people to get minimum wage jobs?
I don't know if, would it draw people to the labor market? Possibly, right? I think it will drive out other people from the labor market as well. You know, I guess my thought is, if I take a person, okay, and I say, I'm just going to increase your wages by $6, does that person have any more education? Do they have any more skill? Do they have any more experience? I haven't done anything to solve the underlying problem of poverty. Poverty is caused because you don't have a lot of skills, you don't have a lot of education, and you don't have a lot of experience. By me waving the government magic wand and saying, you get $15 an hour, I haven't given you more education, I haven't given you more skills, and I haven't given you more experience. I've put a Band-Aid on a problem that will create a different problem. And it's up to you how many questions I'm going to take, because I'm pretty fiery. Okay.
Put this down. Team Women likes to be fully present in front of the audience. So my name is Karina Bohl. I work at the new Office of Labor Standards. It's a division within the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, and we are responsible for implementing Seattle's new minimum wage. So we are responsible for the outreach. We're responsible for enforcing it when someone believes that that they're not being paid the minimum wage. And so we come to this because we believe it's good for workers, we believe it's good for business, and ultimately good for the community. And when we think about what a labor standard is and why we have those to reduce barriers to workplace equity, and why should the government get involved? Why should the government regulate behavior? Why should the government say that you're not allowed to hire this person for $5 an hour when both people agree to it? And there are so many, there's a host of reasons for that. One of them is that low-wage workers don't have bargaining power. There is a distinct power dynamic between two individuals where there's someone who's hungry for work and someone has the pot of money, and this is only the amount of money that they're willing to give you. So perhaps you're so hungry for work that you'll take $5, even though you know it's not going to put food on the table and it's not going to pay rent. When we think about the power dynamics between people of color and white individuals, the power dynamic increases. And so we think that labor standards are going to reduce exploitation, and we have them in many different arenas. We have them in safety. So we have safety regulations. So you have to have safety measures in place for work so that you don't get killed on the job, so that you don't get hurt on the job. And if you do get hurt on the job, that there's workers' compensation to provide you a safety net so that you can continue to work, or so that you're compensated if you lost your finger when you cut it on the meat slicer in the restaurant. We have labor standards in place so that you can't refuse to hire someone because of their race, even though that's totally what you want to do. You are not allowed to do that. We have a labor standard in place so that someone can work a full day's wage and be able to survive not on public assistance. And when you think about it, this minimum wage that we have in Seattle right now, it's $11. It's a step towards a living wage. When we are at 15, it will still be a step towards a living wage. There are many different factors that we can think about with income inequality. One of them are wages. Another one is housing. There are many different things that factor into that puzzle of what makes it a living wage in Seattle. We have control over wage right now, and it's one piece of that puzzle. Let's talk for a moment about subsidizing business. So it's something that Pramila talked about. I think it's an ethical argument that people, no matter what work they're doing, if they're stacking matchsticks, if they're taking care of my sick parent, if they are designing software, if they are serving a hamburger, we value those individuals, and we value them to the extent that we don't want them to have to go to SNAP and get their food stamps for no matter what it is that they're doing. And what's happening right now is that taxpayers are subsidizing business to the tune of $150 billion all the way across the country. So you've got the Walmart statistic, and across the country you've got $150 billion that we are paying so that businesses can pay folks a wage that is requiring them to go to a food bank or to get food benefits or to get other subsidies from the government, housing subsidies from Seattle Housing Authority. Why should someone have to work 8 hours a day and then go through the bureaucratic process of having to go get extra money in order to still be a low-wage worker? And so when we think about it ethically, how businesses pay people a wage that gets them to being self-sufficient without having to go towards public assistance. Another thing to think about is how this is good for business. And in my job, I'm helping to set up the new Office of Labor Standards. We're hiring people. We're doing outreach to businesses. I'm fielding calls from businesses who are trying to make sense of this very complicated minimum wage law that we have in the city. I think we're all in agreement. It could have been a lot simpler, but there are many voices in the room, and employers wanted different ways of getting to 15, so we gave it to them. And now they're trying to make sense of it. And sometimes they're deciding, to heck with it, I'm just going to pay one wage because it's too much administrative cost to take advantage of all these options. But I'm speaking to hundreds and hundreds of employers, 600 employers since last summer trying to make sense of this law, and I hear their stories. And I go to business events and I hear their stories. I do research on it. We know for a fact that a higher minimum wage reduces turnover. For a fact, that is undisputed. On a national level, turnover is 44%. We look at a case study like Costco has higher wages. They pay on average, I think around $21 an hour. Sam's Club, owned by Walmart, has lower wages, about $11 an hour. Sam's Club turnover, 44%. Costco turnover, I think it is 17%. That's a huge, huge discrepancy. How much does turnover cost a business? A lot. 1.5 to 2.5 times an annual salary a year. I've talked to Molly Moon, the ice cream. She sells very expensive ice cream. It's also totally delicious. She pays her pastry chefs that work in the back of the kitchen $15 an hour. 0% turnover since she started doing that. She raised prices on her ice cream. Has business gone down? No, it's gone up. Today I was talking to Bob Donegan, who owns Ivers. They have decided to eliminate tipping as a way of dealing with the minimum wage. They have raised prices 21%. They're redistributing that money among their staff. The complaints they're getting from customers is, we still want to tip. 17% is what Ivers has committed to giving to their servers of the gross receipt of the restaurant bills. And customers say, but I want to leave 20. Can you please just give me a tip line? So Ivers added on a tip line. Lo and behold, customers are tipping on average 12% extra. This is after Ivers has raised its prices 21%. There's also an argument that if one business raises their prices, other businesses will raise their prices as well. So it's a collective thing that happens. A lot of studies about that the minimum wage does not displace jobs. Michael Reich, who Nicole mentioned, he's done studies of neighboring counties, neighboring states. One place has an increased minimum wage, the other one doesn't. The studies show there is no discernible difference in employment. Sometimes employers do move folks to full-time rather than part-time, but overall jobs are not lost. Okay.
I have one question. You probably know what's coming, but this minimum wage is this magic policy that stops turnover, puts money in the economy, no job losses, everything. Why stop at 15? Why not a $50 minimum wage? If $15, I know, yeah, great, brilliant. If $15 makes the world better, wouldn't $50 make the world really, really better? So why not a $100 minimum wage?
Well, so the $15 minimum wage, I wasn't at the table of the legislative process, but I will assume that they looked at what is the median income, what is the living wage. They also thought about what is the impact of raising something 2,000% or whatever that is from $15 to $50 an hour. So there can be different levels of wages. $15 an hour is not necessarily answer locally here. It's going to get us to that place. If you're living in Mississippi, $15 an hour could be too high because the cost of living there is lower. So it could be, we're not saying it has to be $50 an hour. We're just trying to get it to a reasonable place where someone can move towards a level of self-sufficiency.
But I guess what I'm saying is, why not? I mean, we learned today that if we raise it to 15, we're going to create $3 billion of additional revenue. So wouldn't raising it to $50 mean that we raise $100 billion of additional revenue? There's a way to eradicate poverty. I mean, it seems like this is a really...
over the next 10 years.
Okay, so let's go to $50. We get $100 billion and we eradicate poverty with this extra $100 billion.
But I think that's a hyperbolic answer. I mean, it's a hyperbolic proposal. $50 an hour is at the extreme end of the spectrum. So $15 an hour is not extreme. It's getting someone towards self-sufficiency, but not even completely there necessarily. So, I mean, we're doing this incrementally, and I don't think we have to be at the opposite ends of the spectrum in order to make our argument.
While I do think that there are some legitimate sides to the con side, I noticed that a lot of their representatives, especially Mr. Genmuller, completely dismissed the idea about income inequality. Do you personally think that it's a coincidence that the only minorities and the only women on this panel are on the pro argument? Or do you think that that's...
It is a strange coincidence, and I certainly know plenty of men that are for the minimum wage, and vice versa as well. Yeah, absolutely. Ed Murray, our mayor, is the one who championed the minimum wage in the city of Seattle, and he came to a compromise about it. There was fear about it going to the ballot, but he wanted to get business in the room and labor in the room and community activists in the room to try to hammer out a plan that would be decided on with all voices heard. And income inequality has been steadily increasing since 1968. It's just getting worse and worse. I mean, it's sort of in a free fall. So, I mean, this is an attempt to try to stem that. And when we think about racial disparity, I just want to build on what both Pramila and Nicole said, that here in Seattle, as in the rest of the country, this is an argument about the racial disproportionality of people of color in low-wage jobs. Just very quickly, here in Seattle, it's a majority white community, so there's 70% of folks in Seattle are white. So that means that on a number-wise, most low-wage workers are going to be white. But when you look at the percentage of how many white workers are low-wage workers, it's only 25%. Now, how many Hispanics and Latinos make up the population in Seattle? 7%. Of that 7%, how many are low-wage workers? 49%. African Americans are 8% of workers in Seattle. What is the percentage of those 8% of African American workers that are low wage? 43%. Native Americans are 1% of Seattle's working population. 70% of that 1% are low wage workers. I mean, the racial disproportionality is stark. And so, and one of the very incredibly important things about raising the minimum wage is try to reduce that and move us towards equal opportunity. Yes?
And I would say to you, the people who did the study to show that income inequality was unaffected by the minimum wage was a woman of color from Berkeley. So let's follow the numbers, maybe not the symbolism.
I would think that no matter what the race, gender, ethnicity of any researcher, that that's not going to influence that the outcome of that person's work.
Exactly.
Yes, is minimum wage contingent on the inflation level? What happens when the inflation level catches up with the minimum wage? Won't you see the same line right now?
Well, so it's, I mean, you bring up a good point that, I mean, so I talk to employers and they say in, you know, and I forget what year it is, in 2025, it's going to be $18 an hour. That's what a minimum wage will be. And they say, I can't afford that. And I said, but you know what? $18 an hour is not going to buy as much as it does today. So $18 an hour in 2025 is more like 15 today. So, I mean, you're right. So adjusted for inflation, it might catch up. But we're still going to have more earning power now than with that adjusted minimum wage than we do with the state minimum wage right now, which is $9.47, or what it's going to increase to.
So we be able to say that this is just a quick fix?
No, because it's going to continue to increase. I mean, so we get it to 15, and then it's adjusted to inflation every year thereafter. So the buying power that we have at 15 is going to stay constant with the rate of inflation. It's not going to go down. It's just going to stay constant. We're not going to be making the equivalent of $16 an hour. We're going to continue to be making the equivalent of 15.
We have time for one more question.
There's been talk about regression and income inequality. Would a higher minimum wage increase regression, being that Washington is primarily based on sales tax?
I think that it'll put more money in people's pockets, but I think that we still need to address the regressive tax system in Washington. And when Max Willer asked, you know, why does Washington State have such great income inequality? I mean, I think that is one of the many factors, and so it's not going to solve things. It's one piece of the puzzle, as I always say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So next we're going to be going through each of the speakers again. Each of them will get a 5-minute rebuttal period.
You still have to talk?
Yeah,
But it's optional.
Well,
I would rather just take questions. Or a couple of.
We could do a couple of.
Yeah.
Well, I have some things I'd like to rebut. I'm not on this panel. We've got these, we're all for it, we're all against it, and I'm kind of in the middle. You know, I'm a business owner, and for me, it's what impacts me and what impacts my growth. So some of the things I've heard, you know, the subway owners in Seattle, there's only 10% of those that are white. I happen to be the guy that likes to speak, so here I am. I got the invite, I came. So to classify it as the white bad man on this side versus the ethnic woman on the other side, I don't think that's really fair in this case. I just happen to be one of the ones that has the courage to speak out, and so that's why I'm here. I have 3 managers in my subways. My white manager makes 14, my Filipino manager makes 15, and my Mexican manager makes 16. So the argument that the different races make different amounts, for me, you make what you earn. If you're a hard worker for me, you make more money. I don't care if you're green. If you work hard, you're going to make more money. I worked hard. I started at $2. I worked hard, and I made it to where I'm at. My wife, when she graduated, you know, we put her through school with 3 kids. When she graduated, she worked hard. She was a controller within 5 years and started in public accounting. So we both have very strong work ethic. Any employee that works for us that has strong work ethic will make more money for us, period. Because they're working hard, they're earning that. I didn't hear anybody say anything that would justify why franchises are big business. We're not, but I didn't hear that argument come up. So again, I will keep preaching that forever. In 2021, when finally all people are at 15, I will be at 18 because I'm on a different, so we're not all equal then. We're finally equal in 2025. So I need to survive this for quite a while of unequal wages and unequal prices. Another thing, my wife is a very, very, very strong woman. We have a 50-50 marriage. We make all our decisions together. She's a powerhouse woman. She's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. But I'm really more of an independent because in the end, we agree on almost everything. When you sit down and actually can talk to someone, you agree on things that you're surprised that everybody has a different approach in getting there. So I don't like the idea that we ended up being paired. I don't think it was on purpose that we were paired, but I don't like the idea that we got in groups like that so it looks like one group versus the other because, you know, in my house, everything is a discussion and then a decision and then we go forth with it. And sometimes I compromise because maybe I wanted to go to Six Flags, and my wife doesn't want to do that. She just wants to go have a nice dinner at Chipotle or whatever. Or Blazing and Blooming Onion, just an appetizer. It's not the whole thing. The other thing that I heard was the value part of employees. The mayor came and talked to the Seattle Restaurant Alliance. One of the things he said after we finished talking was how we needed to start supporting the youth program. But the fact is, if you're an employer, and it's a hard fact, but if you're an employer and you have to pay $15 an hour, you are looking for a higher quality employee to work. So that means Bellevue and all the other surrounding communities are sending people into Seattle to go get jobs. If I have a better worker that, you know, the Subway commercial, there's always a great employee on the Subway commercial who's smiling and happy, and God, I wish they worked for me. But they don't oftentimes, but they're just a super individual. That's the employee I'm gonna hire. So what happens is the youth, they don't get hired as much. Youth jobs will start going away because you're not gonna take a chance as many times on a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old. I worked when I was 12. I worked a really hard job dishwashing when I was 15, but nobody's going to take a chance on someone like that when they have to pay those wages. So it does have an adverse effect on those people. And then just the last thing here, for me, surviving this is service plus price. So we concentrated on service really hard right before the price increase. And then we haven't really heard anything from our customers because our formula was service plus price. But for a lot of small business owners, they panic about what's going to happen to their bottom lines because they see it and what's going to happen. So what they do is they labor cut plus price. And that's what ends up creating them to go out of business. They don't really know better, and you couldn't talk to them and tell them to do it differently, but that's what they do. But what I hear everybody that's arguing on the case, they're okay to throw those small businesses aside and say things like, well, small businesses fail all the time. Does that make it okay to make a policy and not going into it the right way? I just think we're rushing, we've rushed, we've gone too high, and then the two sides can't really get together and talk. And the compromises that were made were all silly compromises that go away. They don't mean anything. I get a tip credit for a couple of years. I don't get a tip credit because I'm a big business. I get an insurance credit, but then that goes away in a couple of years. They were all kind of silly little things kind of passed by people in the room, but they really didn't conquer the real big issue, which would have been some real good compromise. That's all I got from everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to, after saying that we shouldn't take more time, I realized that there are a couple things I wanted to just respond to. And the first one is that I really agree. I'll let everyone know first. Goes in chat. Extra credit only goes so far. The first thing I wanted to say is I really agree with the speaker that just spoke. I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Jones, with David. I really agree with David that, you know, this isn't about pitting one against the other. And I started my original 7 minutes by saying that we had to make a lot of compromises, that we knew that there were some people that were going to be, you know, affected much worse than others, and some people that would benefit much more than others. But that is the way that legislation gets made, and you try to make it better, and there might be opportunities to continue to make this law better. And I think, as you've heard, you know, there are many owners who actually fought, the Restaurant Association fought for a number of things in the room. And what they're finding is some of their restaurants are saying, you know what, it's just too much of a pain. I'm not going to do it that way. I'm just going to go to 15 right away. I'm going to take away the tip. And so sometimes in the implementation, you actually get to some of the best policy. And on the franchise question, I did just want to answer that question specifically because it was a really tough thing. But the problem is you have McDonald's, right? And then you have franchises like yours. And I do believe that the franchise model, to your point earlier, your set of questions, the franchise model is deeply flawed. Does it mean it doesn't give people serious opportunity to start a business where they wouldn't have otherwise? No, it absolutely does. Many of my constituents, residents, friends own Subways. As you said, 90% I think are owned by immigrants, people of color.
In Seattle. I don't know what it is everywhere else.
I believe that statistic because I know a lot of those people. They're in my district. So I think that what we had to do was figure out how to get at the largest number of people, recognizing that there would be some people that probably would have a tough time. And I don't know what to say about that other than that is the way we had to craft the legislation. And a lot of the changes that we made, a lot of the compromises that you call silly compromises, many of us thought they were silly compromises, but they were what actually was asked for by the other side. They weren't actually the things that we would have preferred. A very simple bill. As you might know, my bill in the state Senate is $12 for everybody. There's no differentials, there's no tip credits, there's no insurance credits. It's just everybody does it, because ultimately I actually believe that's what the market takes you towards. The other thing I wanted to say about business in particular, because this isn't sort of a fight of the low-wage worker versus the business. We had an amazing set of support from businesses, small businesses in particular in Seattle. Businesses like Tutabella Pizzeria, and I really hope you support these businesses in particular. Molly Moon's Ice Cream, McKinney Howell at Plum Bistro. These are businesses that came to the table and said, you know what, it's going to be tough for us, but we want to do this. And some of them had already implemented things that were about sort of distributing the income that comes in more fairly. So instead of, when you have a tip system, for example, even though we are one of the states that does not allow a tip penalty, we like to call it, in the state of Washington, so you have to pay the minimum wage and then your tips are above that. What happens is the front of the house workers get those tips, right? But the back of the house people who are washing the dishes and doing all that work, they don't. The big businesses, the bigger restaurants, more upscale restaurants get way more tips than the pho place that's down the street. And when we start talking about tips, the other thing you have to remember is you have a small business like Elliott Bay Books, or some local bookstore down the street. They don't, or the little mom and pop grocery store, they don't have tips as part of their model. Tips is part of the restaurant model, and I've had many conversations with restaurant owners, both who disagree and agree on minimum wage. And what they agree to also is that the restaurant model is built on this idea of tips coming in order to sustain that model. But that is a flawed model. It means that instead of the business paying the wage for a worker to be able to sustain themselves, a tip is. Now, if you take away the tip policy and you do what IVARS did, which I think is ultimately what, it's what Europe does, it's what a lot of places do, where you just build the tip in, then you start to be able to actually have a model that may be more sustainable in the long term for businesses to not have to close all the time, and also to distribute those tips, well, those wages really, because it becomes a wage, not a tip, between all of your workers across front and back. So you can, and that's what a lot of these businesses that came forward had already started to do. That's what McKinney does at Plum, is, you know, there's a pool of tips, and that pool of tips gets distributed amongst all of the workers. And they came to it together because they understood that this makes sense, right? You can't do your job at the front of the house if you don't have somebody doing the stuff that nobody gets to see. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just that I really, you know, you could create a sort of a polar opposite for every argument. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out how we address the issues of income inequality. This doesn't do it. Let me be really clear. This doesn't address the issue of income inequality. We have a lot of things we're going to have to do in Seattle to address the issue of income inequality. But does it start to lift the floor for the people at the very bottom? Absolutely. Does it start to address the fact that we have people that simply cannot earn what they need to earn to even barely exist? I don't want to say live, because this really doesn't get us there. Absolutely. Is this a compromise that, as silly as some of the things may be, was designed to actually take input from people across the city and to have people at the table? I can't tell you how many slammed doors we had, how many times we thought the process was going to blow up, the mayor would blow up, we would blow up, everyone was blowing up. You know, we left the room, we had to come back. Did it ultimately result in something that allows us to move forward even though it's imperfect? I believe it is. So I really urge you all to, a debate format is always one where you know, and I've been on with Bill O'Reilly and Fox News, and so you always want to kind of, you know, my point is this and your point is this, but really the truth is in the middle. This isn't a Republican-Democrat issue. 4 states passed a minimum wage increase. I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't get to say the states, and I think it's important to know what they are. Alaska, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Arkansas. These are not Democratic states. So this is not a Democrat versus Republican issue, and I think David's family situation is actually probably much more indicative of the rest of the country, where Democrats and Republicans are coming together and saying, we want to make it possible for working people in the United States of America to have a better life. I came to this country as an immigrant when I was 16 years old to go to college. My parents took all the money that they had, it was about $4,000, and used it to send me here to go to get an education, because they believed that this was the best place that I was going to be able to do that. And you know what? That is such a sacrifice. They knew I was never going to come back. They knew I would never be able to look after them or live on the same continent. But it was that education, that determination, and that idea of what America is, that we actually allow people to come here with nothing and to make it. And so that's really what I would close with, is just saying, you know, there's a lot of truth in the middle of black and white. There's a lot of gray. And I really do urge you, I join my colleague, Representative Manweller, in urging you to get educated about these issues and to think about these as strands of truth that come together to create the reality that we have. Thank you.
Can we just end it on that? 'Cause that was really good.
Yeah, we can either, everyone is welcome to leave, or also if you want
Yeah,
to,
we
like,
can bring
stay and
good
do
questions up here.
that would be great. Okay. Thanks for coming. You're gonna be